Welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, where we are starting a new series called United Together, where we're looking at different passages in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church. And today, joined by Pastor Chris Bantz from our St. Charles campus, rocking his local 636
Yes.
t-shirt. What's the story behind the 636?
Well, so that's our area code, right, for
right.
St. Charles. And there's kind of a brand that promotes St. Charles and all things happening in St. Charles. And so, yeah.
Cool.
They do T-shirts.
They do T-shirts. They, do support local businesses and all that. Yeah. Have you ever worked out of their office? They've got a kind of a cool little common space.
Yeah. No, I haven't. I'm mostly just posted up at either Upshot or Course.
Yeah, well, good places.
Yeah.
So today we're starting a new series. It's my goal. I know, man, I feel like I said this in a couple episodes ago that, man, I've been so inconsistent with releasing deep dive episodes. Like in Daniel, for instance, we did chapters 1, chapters 2 through 5, and then chapter 6. And so 3 episodes for that. My goal for this series is to be on top of it and get these things out on the weekly.
Okay.
Because the First Corinthians, what we're doing in this series is we are, it's kind of a topical series in that we've identified different areas of where there might be division in the church and pulled from the letter to just speak to particular subjects or topics. And so there's things in the letter that we're not actually going to talk about in the sermons. There's going to be chapters that we just don't get to. And so the deep dive, I think, would be a great opportunity for us to hit some of those things. But also, like, this series, at least, we planned these things 8-9 months ago.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a timely series for, when you look at culture, when you look at society, all the differences, divisions, polarizations, politically, socially, I mean, all these, you name it. But then even for our particular church, our local church, this is, again, a timely series. Like, what does it look like to pursue unity despite different experiences, despite different opinions on things, despite kind of a murky, cloudy, like, hey, who even are we right now as a church, and what does God have for us next? So I think it's going to be a really good study. And so in today's episode, what I want to do is kind of just set the context for 1 Corinthians, like what's going on, why is Paul writing them, and then look at kind of the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, because we're going to talk. Actually, I'm going to use chapter 2 this weekend, but we're not going to preach it expositorily. And so I do think there's something that Paul's doing here that is unique that we don't see in other places in the New Testament. So I guess let's start with just context. Chris, what's going on?
Yeah. So in the Church of Corinth, they don't have it all figured out.
No.
Which I think is a fair statement.
Yeah.
Which should give us some hope, right?
Yep.
Because we're prone to see brokenness in our local churches and think the sky is falling. What are we going to do? Mm-hmm. Well, okay, there was brokenness in churches from the first century on.
Mm-hmm. We like to idealize, romanticize the early church. Our churches, we just need to get back to the early church model. We just need to be biblical in how we do church. And it's like, have you read the New Testament?
Yeah. They did a lot great. I mean, don't get me wrong, but they also had their fair share of stuff to deal with. Yeah. So in Corinth, there's debate, there's commentaries, there's speculation on exactly what the scandal is and to what degree. But you have divisions, you have scandal, you have brokenness happening in the church at Corinth. And so Paul is going to write a letter to them to say, hey, knock it off, get together, be unified in these key core tenets the Spirit and God's Word and faithfulness and get united in these things and move forward. Stop fracturing.
Yeah. And Corinth was uniquely situated, right? So where it was, it's kind of at this crossroads of different trade routes.
Yeah.
It was, so you had a lot of kinds of people, right? You had people who were very wealthy because of where it was in the trade routes. You had these business guilds. You had a lot of different people who were worshiping different gods and different religions. It's kind of this it's this marketplace of ideas and socioeconomics and all of these things that shouldn't necessarily cause division within the church, but like you can't not bring it with you too. Like it existed in Corinth. And so I actually think in a lot of ways, Corinth is like a modern day, what we experience in the United States. And so anyway, that's kind of the context for which Paul is writing. And in the end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, Paul talks about this idea of wisdom and how it relates to the cross and how it relates to Christ. And it's interesting because Paul, as we've talked about multiple occasions, right? This guy was, if you could, create like top draft pick for, fantasy board of missionaries, like Paul was it. He was Greek educated. He was Jewish by religion and heritage. He was a Roman citizen. He was a tent maker, right? He had this other side hustle, as well. And all of these things, put together just make him a great conduit and vehicle for what God's wanting to do to the Gentile world. As part of that, though, especially with his Greek education, like he was trained in the art of rhetoric. Yeah, like he could go to the public square. We see this in Athens in Acts 17. Like he can go in those logos, pathos, ethos, like these schools of rhetoric. Like he was schooled, and yet he chooses not to do the thing when he goes and preaches in Corinth. Like what's going on with that?
Yeah. Well, to your point, Paul is this really unique guy who's a bit like a unicorn. And we would do well to remember that Rome, this is overtly simplified, but Rome put roads on Greek thought. So this is still holdover. And Paul has an extreme handling of the Old Testament scriptures well, due to oral memorization that like we would be quite envious of. So all these things are at play here. But Paul is ultra savvy when it comes to knowing his audience. Like there are times where he gets so frustrated with the Jews where he just kind of says, the blood's on your head, I'm leaving. Yeah. And then there's other moments like at Mars Hill where he's celebrating and observing the culture around him, and he does lean into the Greek philosophy, and then he pivots to say, oh, but you're missing this one thing. And so I think in Corinth, you're going to see him uniquely interact with those people in maybe a less, a less didactic way, a less like philosophical way, because sometimes the cognitive, intellectual, philosophical way, sometimes that is the net you need to catch some people. Sometimes that's not the net. Like sometimes you need to be more, like a mother hen who gathers her chicks, So there's a variety of ways to interact with the local churches. Yeah, in the ancient world.
Yeah. So in chapter 1, Paul, he's setting the table for, what's going to come, throughout this letter, acknowledging, hey, there's divisions in this church, right? There are different people who are following different leaders, whether it's Apollos, whether it's himself, Paul, whether it's Cephas, which is Peter. Some are just saying, hey, listen, I just follow Jesus. Like, it's a trump card there. And he asks this question, is Christ divided? I baptized, this is Paul, none of you, except for Crispus and Gaius, so that none of you can say you were baptized in my name. And then in 17, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Man, that's a fascinating line, right? Because when I think about we prepare messages, sermons, the way we say things matters. The way we structure our arguments, the way we structure our main points and the illustrations that we use. And yet Paul is saying, like, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. What's going on there? Like, why would he choose to not use all of these other tools that he has at his disposal?
Yeah, because he's not going to do anything that might be a stumbling block. He's not going to use anything that may be a detractor or a sidebar or a rabbit hole. Like, think of what Paul could have done when it comes to, whether people are celebrating him or Apollos or someone else. Paul, in a prideful moment, could have run the opposite direction and elevated his speech even more to draw attention to himself and to say, hey, look at my rhetoric, look at my knowledge of the Old Testament. Yeah, Apollos, yeah, he's okay, but I'm really the preacher you want to be listening to. So if the temptation to pride would have been received and acted upon, Paul really could have gone to a place of elevating himself over other teachers and elders and pastors of his day. But in this moment, he's saying, okay, that's actually not the path I'm going to want to take, because it might just spark even further debate of who's greater, Paul or Apollos or whoever.
Yeah.
I think, so I recently got done teaching a C.S. Lewis class, and I think C.S. Lewis is an incredible example of this. Like, this is a guy that is running in Cambridge and Oxford circles, and he could have put forward the most intellectual argument on the face of the earth. Like, he could go toe to toe with the best minds of his day, and he had the degrees and the expertise and the, accumulation of knowledge to back it up. But what does he do? He actually often runs to emotive, everyday common places, because he knows for the random guy walking the streets of London or Liverpool that will never set foot in a classroom in Cambridge or Oxford, like, how do they see the cross? How do they see the gospel? And so Lewis is not going to write in a way that's a stumbling block for them to see the cross to overcomplicate things. So I think that's maybe a slightly more modern example of something that Paul is demonstrating of, like, okay, why would I go to great lengths to make things more complicated that would be potentially self-serving or divisive if the cross being seen is the focal point of everything I'm about?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Okay.
That's great. I want to just read a few more verses here. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. And then verse 20. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. It's interesting because, at least in Jewish circles, even in the Old Testament, right, the wisdom would not be associated with someone who hangs on a tree.
Right.
Right? I mean, those are two, right, very opposite things.
Yeah.
And so I think Paul's doing something here. But I do think that so often, the wisdom of God and the wisdom of men are not synonymous. So my question, I guess, Chris, is Paul, I do think that he always has the mission at hand. What does my audience need to hear? What do I need to say as to not get in the way of the gospel? But is there also something crafted in his argument that, hey, listen, the thing that I'm pointing to, right, that death is actually gain, not life. The cross is true power. It's not a curse. Like, is there something in the water there of, like, even the way he's communicating this gospel message that, like, even rooted in the argument itself and the way he's saying it speaks to what true wisdom is? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we would misunderstand Paul here to think that he's saying something about the Christian faith being unreasonable. The reason why he's pointing to things like folly is to say this is a kingdom that is upside down. like no matter how eloquent you could argue it, it is the economy of God's kingdom, the value system of God's kingdom is going to run against the grain of not only the Roman Empire, but the fallenness and brokenness of a post-Genesis 3 world.
Yeah.
And so some of the things that Christians are going to do, surrender, self-sacrifice, martyrdom, like all these things that are in the water in the first century church, are going to seem like folly to a kingdom that has built itself on being a great military power, kind of the power center of the world, whereas thriving and survival and self-preservation are going to be massive values. And now you've got Christians living this self-sacrificial way. It's like the kingdom's been flipped upside down. So it's not an unreasonableness. It is a contrariness.
Yeah, that's so good. 26, for consider your calling, brothers, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. I think, Paul, obviously, he is so adept at understanding his audience and always rooting the thing that he is speaking about in the gospel message. So what's one of the greatest divisions, right, in this church is you have these different leaders, these different individuals who others are trusting or are preferring or what have you. And Paul's just like tearing it all down. He's like, no, none of that, right? Like we only boast in God, which is very contrary to everything the world is leading. So Chris, I guess like we have a few minutes left, pastorally, like what do we do with this?
Yeah, I think pastorally, maybe 2 or 3 lessons to be learned is, one, each audience, we should be ready to give an answer for each audience according to what could be seen as effective or wise in that moment. That doesn't mean you water down or you change the message itself, but we should be ready to give an account for the hope that is within us. And sometimes that's packaged slightly differently depending on the audience we're around.
Yeah.
Number 2 is we have to accept at some level there is a not only a mystery, but a how do I put this? There is aspects of our faith and our way of life and the way we relate to God in the universe that if we're not content until others affirm or condone or say, yeah, that makes sense. If we're waiting for that, we may never get it.
Yeah.
Because the economy and the value system of God's kingdom in at least 1%, maybe 99%, is always going to run contrary to whatever context we find ourselves in. And so, if we're waiting for the day where others around us, non-believers, say, oh, yeah, the way you live just makes total, absolute sense, like we're going to be waiting until we die.
Yeah.
Because the way we speak, the way we love, the way we spend our money, the way we spend our time, like this should all, to some degree, run contrary to a value system that is quite different from our kingdom. Yeah. And so I think that's another important thing. And I think in all of that, we can learn from Paul, like, if we do develop our skills, if we do develop our wealth or whatever, our standing in life, there will be the temptation eventually to say, oh yeah, I am better than Apollos. And in that moment, do we have the humility? Do we have the heart shaped by Christ to say, no, we only boast in Christ? And it can't be I think about like an author of a book, but then sometimes there's like an et al. And there's like other names listed. Yeah. I sometimes think we think the kingdom is like that, where it's like, yeah, Jesus is the big name, but make sure my name is on the cover of the book too, below Jesus's. Even if the font is smaller, it's still got to be there.
It's still there.
That's the temptation. That's the you can be like God whisper that comes to us, echoes from the garden. So I think we have to combat that to say, no, like we're okay if our name's not on the cover at all, because the boast is exclusively the folly of the cross in Jesus. And that's easy to say.
Oh, it's so easy to say. I was even thinking just from like an ego standpoint, right? Paul, like, started this church. Like, he preached the gospel in Corinth.
Yes. He's getting invited to the conferences.
Yeah. And yet, like, what's the effect on him to hear, like, oh, now he started this thing, and then now all these other people are coming in, and they're getting influenced, and they're the ones that are listening to. And some people are like, hey, we don't even need to probably listen to this Paul guy anymore because, hey, Apollos, man, he has some real flowery rhetoric. Like, he's a little edgy when he preaches. We like him. What's that effect on him? And I think we see throughout Corinthians. I mean, Apollos is mentioned in 3 or 4 different chapters, and so there's something happening there. And I think when I first read Corinthians, I was younger. I'm just like, who's this Apollos guy? Like, what a fuddy-duddy, like what? What's happening here? Paul's not condemning Apollos. Mm-hmm. He's condemning the unnecessary divisions and the unnecessary focus on the human rather than the Christ.
Yeah. And I think Paul's working with an understanding of a mustard seed kingdom where one plants, one waters, one sees the growth. And there's so many roles to play along that journey. Yeah. And you don't really know at any given point if you're the one planting, tilling, watering, mm-hmm. or, then finally, when you see the growth, it's obvious, and that gives us hindsight. But when you're in the work of being discipled by Jesus and making disciples, you don't always know in the timeline where you're at in that. And that's probably a bit frustrating to us, but it does give us this perspective mm-hmm. to say, I don't have to be the hero of the story. I don't have to be the one hitting the home run. Yeah. Like, I don't have to be the one that receives all the accolades or pats on the back for this or this or this. Like, I can be a part of the process in which the mustard seed is germinating into something quite beautiful. Yeah, that's great. Well, Chris, thanks for joining. Next week, we will continue in this series. We'll look at what does it look like to be united together in spite of our differences, right? As people who've been created in God's image, we have natural differences, and that's okay. How do we celebrate those things and yet still pursue unity? So I hope that you will check us out for that. You can find this resource and more on our website, calvary.church/unitedtogether or calvary.church/resources. As always, if you have a question, if you want to give us some feedback, if you have a question you want us to wrestle with on a future episode, email us at podcasts@calvary.church. We will both respond to you via email and then also collect those and use those as a special Ask the Pastor section in a future episode. So go in grace and peace, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.